Hi everyone, I'm Drake, he, they, them, also known as the Lion Knight 42. Welcome to the first episode of Roll for Perspective, a show where I sit down with content creators, DMs, artists, streamers, and more within the TTRPG space to offer tips, tricks, and insight. For this episode, we're going to have our first DM roundtable, where we'll be discussing how to prepare for specific target audiences, the impact it can have on how you prepare your games, and more. So I figure we'll have everyone introduce themselves. Claire, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Hi, I'm Claire, she, her. I run the YouTube channel, The Infinite Construct, which is dedicated to Numenera and other science fantasy TTRPGs. I'm also a co-host of the video game podcast or video game and nerddom podcast, Moontrash. And beyond that, I'm a composer, electronic musician, and guitar player. And that's me.
Bethany?
Hi, my name is Bethany. I am she, her. I am the Dungeon Master for the Land of Dark Dreams campaign setting and a current cast member for the Component cast. I have been doing the content creation for Dungeons and Dragons since late second edition. Go reaching back there into the 90s. Beyond that, I am a former Navy intelligence analyst and a cybersecurity analyst.
Very cool. Thank you guys for joining me today. I'm very excited.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
So, first, I'd like to talk about how everyone got into TTRPGs. Bethany, do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Well, to make a very long story much shorter, it was a bunch of really nerdy kids who got together to play Dungeons and Dragons. My friend's father at the time ran second edition D&D, AD&D for those who are reaching back. Yes, I know what FACO is.
Oh, I hate FACO.
Going that far back. Started with that, and it's kind of what got me exposed to it. Not really like the concept of mechanics, because I was relatively young at the time. But when third edition came out, I really bit my teeth into that, and mostly through exposure through the digital medium of role-playing games that were D&D based, like Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights, and that kind of setting. Beyond that, it was other games with friends that I played: Vampire the Masquerade, Call of Cthulhu, other White Wolf brands. Now these days, it's D&D 5e and Cyberpunk Red.
Both solid choices. Been meaning to play more Cyberpunk Red. I definitely have to do that soon.
I really recommend it.
Claire?
Yeah, so I got into tabletop role-playing games after I was getting kind of bored of where video games were going in the late 2000s, early 2010s. I think there was a desire I had for where those were going to go, and they were mostly fine. But I was looking for something different, and I really didn't play any TTRPGs as a teenager or anything like that. So around that time, I decided to kind of get into this thing called D&D. So at the time, that was 4th edition. Played a bit of that. That was what it was. I really got into Pathfinder. Pathfinder first edition was like my main game for a very long time. And kind of the side interest I always had was Numenera and the Cypher system. And I kind of slowly pivoted to that being my kind of full-time sort of game. And these days it's a Cypher system, and very recently Morris Publishing's Level Up Advanced 5th edition has kind of really caught my attention, because it sort of brought a lot of what I liked about Pathfinder 1 to 5e. So it's still 5th edition, which is really nice, but it's got a lot of other things going on. But yeah, so I do, and that's kind of what my channel is focusing on now. It's like Cypher System and Advanced 5th edition. And that's, yeah.
Very awesome. So, Bethany, I know that you're a professional DM, right? You do like pay-for-play stuff.
That's what I tell myself.
So, how did you get into it, and what's it like prepping for games?
Well, I got into being professional DM because I couldn't ever get into a game. It kind of started 2019 or so. I tried to get into a digital game because I didn't have a lot of friends, or I just moved and wanted to play some D&D. And tried to join games on advertisement sites like Roll20, and could not get into a game for anything. Hundreds and hundreds would apply, and there's only so many spots. So I tried out somebody else who was charging for a game, and after playing through it, went, I could do that. So I did. And it kind of grew from there. I started getting my first rounds of clients. I started improving my game and got to the point where I started figuring out how to tell a story that was compelling in such a way that it attracted people. And I appealed to the role playing sense of community with all the people who loved Critical Role and Adventure Zone and DCA, all the people that wanted a really rich narrative, and I kind of appealed to that. Prep work, it's consumed my life for the last year and a half. I have built a campaign that I run that goes from levels 1 to 20 that has taken a considerable amount of time to put together and account for all of the insane things players can do, and accounting for D&D's or 5e's issue with later level balancing has taken a lot of effort. So hours and hours and hours and hours of prep work. But as a paid DM, you join my games, you get artwork, music, handouts, voices for my creatures, the things you would expect out of a paid game. It's not just me telling a story. There is a quality to it that I really, really, really put into my games.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really cool, and that is something that, there's we've talked about it a bit before we got on, how there's this really big discourse about paying DMs for games and stuff, and how it really does kind of boil down to the amount of time that you're spending playing is not the same as the amount of time that the DM has to spend prepping and working on stuff and practice and whatever else. And that's something that a lot of people don't really think about when they think about, oh, well, why would I pay someone to run these games?
My general response is, you can't get what I do for free, probably. If you can, then you have an amazing DM. Cherish them, because there are so few people willing to put that effort in and give you the quality that I think a player like that deserves. The other big argument I hear is, why would I charge my friends? And I don't. They're not my friends. I'm friendly, I am professional, but they are clients.
Yeah.
They're not my friends.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important distinction to make. There's nothing stopping you at all from running a home game for friends of yours and being like, yeah, we're just going to play D&D. It doesn't inherently mean that everyone you play with is going to be your friend, because like you said, you're a professional. It's a service that you provide that they're paying you for. It's important to, have that perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and like for me, like I come from the world, like I taught guitar for many years and I got paid for that. So when I look at paid DM work, like, it makes sense. Like, and people already pay to play in a lot of places. People pay to go to conventions to play. There just like with people who pay to get lessons for guitar, right? Like there is a market for people who need that and who are looking for that level of professionalism. And then there are people who have friends who can teach them how to play guitar, or an older relative or something like that. So yeah, I have not found the paid DM stuff to be foreign or weird at all. Like it makes sense.
And as far as pricing is concerned, it should not be terribly expensive. A month's worth of games from me, which is 4 hours ish per game of good solid playtime, is $65 a month.
That's a very reasonable number.
That's a not even a good dinner. That's a basic dinner at a diner with your partner.
Yeah.
That's not that expensive. So yeah. It's not like a business who's charging for human resources and getting team building exercises. I'm not charging no $700 a head. No, this is basic. Yeah, very basic.
Perfectly reasonable. Even there was a time where Claire and I used to play together, where Claire would go into a shop where I played out of, and
that's right. Yep.
Yeah, and they would charge. And they would charge for you to come in and play, and it didn't stop us from occasionally having games where I'd run games at home and be like, "Do you want to take part?" And, yeah, it's important to remember that there is that separation between the two.
And despite everything, D&D stuff is expensive.
Yeah.
especially if you do it live. But digital is not cheap either. It costs money to get marketplace materials for maps. It costs license fees to get music, especially if you do stream shows. And those of you who do stream shows are familiar with that one. Books, if you want to buy from a small shop and not go to, give your money to Bezos, it's $50
Yep.
easy for a book. So it's not unreasonable.
So, Claire, I know you have been setting up games for YouTube. You had one recently that you ran, Exegesis, and I know you were working on parts for the new one. So, what kind of prep work do you do? And when you start putting games together for YouTube stuff, how large of a role does it play in aiming for a wider audience than just the people at your table?
So the current project, which is Polarity, that has been a unique round of preparations because as it sort of implies from the name, basically what Polarity is this Numenera concept where it takes place in Numenera, but there are two parties. One party is playing in the Cypher system, the other party is playing in Level Up Advanced 5th edition, and it's a connected story. So the prep work for that has been very challenging and very, in some cases, last minute. It's kind of stabilized now because right now we are filming Polarity Eisegesis, which is the second half that takes place in Advanced 5th edition, and a lot of the story kind of premise material has already been set by what happened in Polarity Exegesis. So the prep work for that was a lot of potential outcomes. And a lot of that has changed and actually gotten a little bit easier since the Infinite Construct pivoted from doing live streamed shows. I don't do that anymore. I only do pre-recorded stuff. And that has taken an immense amount of stress off and has also given me the versatility of editing it with a lot more freedom and kind of flair later on. But as to the prep work, I mean, again, because now these are pre-recorded, I don't have to think of them so much as a performance in the moment. I can actually think of them more as a game. So now my prep work has been closer to how I would prepare games for friends. So it's thinking of interesting premises, interesting challenges, interesting ways to work with the setting, interesting ways to work with the rules. Whereas before I was thinking a bit more about what would work really well for a live setting. So one of the streams I did last year was kind of a sort of demo, if you will, of one of the Monte Cook Games books, Ruins of the Jade Colossus, Ruins of the Previous Worlds, which has this whole Numenera ruin building engine. And so that game just showcased a ruin that could be built with that. And so it was kind of, here's the ruin and that's that. And I didn't want to stray too far from that because it was going to be live, and handling things that would get off the rails would be a little strange. And also, while I'm very comfortable improving while you're performing is kind of a difficult thing. So now that it's been pre-recorded, I've had the freedom to kind of devise multiple paths, multiple outcomes that could sort of happen, and kind of be free to just sort of run this like 90% as how I would run a game at home with friends. There's a little bit of a, it is going to be shown. So there still is a little bit of a performative aspect to it than there would otherwise be. But yeah, it's, thinking of interesting scenarios. Yeah. Asking myself what David Lynch would do. And that's kind of, that's how I prepare.
My two biggest complaints about having to do a live stream game is sometimes you're expected to interact with the audience, and when you're playing a D&D game, that's not really feasible.
Even when I did do some live stream stuff, I already had a policy that I would not do that. I'm not necessarily, the channel is not necessarily big enough to have to worry about that, and two, I just that is not, if that's what somebody wants, they can get that from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Whether it's live or pre-recorded, my focus is on the game.
Yeah. Now that being said, the other advantage, I guess, of pre-recording a game is if you're playing a very technical game that requires, I'll use 5e as an example, and you're playing like an artificer, and a person wants to spend 2 hours number crunching how you're going to build X, Y, and Z. Nobody wants to watch that.
No.
Yeah, so you can cut a lot of that out, which with Polarity Eisegesis, because that's an advanced 5th edition, it is, I mean, I'm still running it, so I tend to have a more narrative flair than I do a mechanical one. But even with that one, there were a few more references to books that will be eased in the editing process, if not cut
Yeah.
out entirely.
Do you hate editing?
I love editing.
Bless you then.
It's really intensive work. The only thing I worry about, honestly, is carpal tunnel syndrome.
That's fair.
But other than that, like I genuinely love editing. I love the process of it. I love working with DaVinci Resolve. So
I guess somebody has to. Some of the pre-recorded stuff that I ever worked, I could spend 8 hours editing. Either I was just bad at it or slow, but I could not. I don't have the attention span to do it. So props to you for that one.
thank you.
Yeah, it's I have kind of a love-hate relationship when it comes to editing. It's one of those things where I think as soon as I'm at a point where I can hire an editor, that's exactly what I'm going to be doing.
Sure.
But I'll sit down and I'll start it and I'll be very excited for it. And then, 2, 3, 4 hours and I'm like, okay, it's time to put this away, step to the side, do literally anything for my mental health, and then come back.
Yeah, I'm a bit too much of a control freak with that. I have a very specific way I want things to look and sound on screen, and I prefer that to be me in charge of that.
That's one of my biggest constraints of a live show is I want it to look a certain way, and if something goes wrong, mechanically speaking, a camera goes off, or
that's the other thing with live stuff is there's just way too much anxiety, and managing that anxiety, like I've wonderful Spectrum New York City internet I have here most of the time works, but like sometimes it just drops, and I don't want to think about that.
No, I agree. And if it were up to me, all of my D&D shows would be pre-recorded.
Yeah, that's what I'm planning to do. Along with the launch of this, I'm going to be launching a show, Dice Trays Action, soon, which is going to be working the same way. It's all going to be pre-recorded, it's all going to be edited, and then final product is pushed out, because I can't really be there and be interacting with the audience. It's really pulls you out of immersion, which is a huge issue for me, and so I think
it's
that's
easier
just the
when you
best
have
way
a
to
crew
go.
of people, and even like with interacting with the comments, if you have someone who is dedicated to do that, then that's possible. That's something that is a lot more achievable when you can scale up to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh God, the other problem with live stream shows, man, you have the Twitch cast, the Twitch chat yelling at you about rules you're doing wrong, or
my goodness,
telling you how to play the game. Oh my Lord.
Mm-hmm. It's awful.
You'll get that on pre-recorded stuff too.
Yeah, but there you don't care.
Yeah, it's not distracting. And you can just shrug it off.
Yeah. It's not distracting. Yeah.
And the other upside is, putting these up now, you get to be able to interact with people in the chat.
Right.
Really
yeah.
nice.
You get to interact. Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that I know is a big issue for when you're doing both like paid games and games that you're going to be running on like YouTube and things like that is keeping track of time a lot more than you would have to necessarily in like a home game. Is there any things that you do specifically to keep things on track or focused on plot? Bethany?
I mean, I have a 4 hour plus or minus 15 time limit for all of my games. The only time I go over that is if it's a really important, critical boss fight that's going to take a while. Sometimes I'll push it to 5 hours, but that's very rare. I have learned how to pace myself through, I don't want to call it like a sixth sense, but you just get a sense when you're writing a session of how long it's going to take a player to solve a trap, go through a combat encounter, because when you run a game for 5 to 6 people, which is about where I run it, you can average, if you've played it long enough, how long the average player takes to make a turn, what they're going to do. And that, that depends on the player, it depends on the class. So I have to give myself again, plus or minus 15. And if I feel like a player or players are stalling too much, I will drop a hint somehow, and like, I will interrupt somebody if I have to. Like, all right, we need to. You guys need to make a decision. Is usually what I go to. Or occasionally, if it's a live game, I'll just drop a dice and go, huh, interesting.
Yeah, I'm not great at pacing myself. I would say with the last shoot we did for Polarity Eisegesis, I've definitely gotten better. I tend to sort of also revolve around a 4-hour kind of pace. What I've started doing now is in that final hour, I try to be a bit more honest with myself and think like, how much of this adventure is left? What's a good point with what's left and where they are right now if we're in that 4th hour to start reaching a conclusion. And I'll kind of set a perspective in mind. So maybe they're working on a puzzle and I'll decide like once they finish this puzzle, we'll hit a narrative beat and then we'll continue next time.
Yep. It's also the same if you're hitting about 3 hours 20 minutes, but
Mhm.
you're about to run into a combat encounter that could take an hour. And I'll
Yep.
say, I know it's a little short, guys. However, you're about to roll right into an encounter. This one's going to take a while. It's going to push longer than I'm comfortable with. So we're going to end it here. I don't like doing that. That is my least preferred option. But sometimes
You don't
the
have a
dice roll,
choice.
the dice roll, they roll.
Yeah. And, on the flip side of that, and I'm not going to give too much away of the next installment of Polarity, but I mean, having your next session begin with an exhilarating encounter can sometimes be a really good way to jump back into it. So it's not the worst thing in the world to be like, oh, like we're heading toward a major boss. Let's put a pin in it. I mean, find a narratively,
Sure.
decent way of saying that. And then the next time you're starting, you're in the middle of something very exciting. So that's a good opportunity to do that.
Clickety clackety, you're about to get attackety.
The challenge I have, I'm often reminded of there's a no clip documentary on the making of The Witcher 3, and it was toward when they were finishing up that game, they began to get very worried that there wasn't enough content and that people were going to play through it too quickly. I'm not kidding. That game of all games, and that is like, I have that anxiety when I'm working on a module. I always think like there's not enough material here, and I have to remember like I know everything that's going to happen. They
know
don't.
everything and how to go through everything. Yeah.
And I know how to go through everything.
I run a tutorial session for every new group I run through.
Mm.
And it's designed for 5 players taking 3.5 hours. I've seen some groups smoke through it in 2, but I've also seen groups take 3 sessions to get through it.
Yep.
So it really depends on how long your players stop and smell the roses.
Yeah.
I've definitely learned over the time I've spent running games that you have to be really good at the first couple sessions of feeling out your party and seeing what everyone's here for, right? Because what they're looking for is going to play a huge role in how much time they end up taking doing things, and the way that they interact with each other based on those roles can also change that time a lot.
You asked me earlier what my prep work is, and I will still say to this day, the best prep any DM can do is a well-established session 0.
Sure.
You go into a game. I call it the riot act. I don't know what anybody else calls it, but it's a basic list of requirements of this is what you should expect out of me as a DM. This is what you're going to get out of me as a DM. This is what I expect out of you as a player. Most of it boils down to don't be a dick, but that's pretty vague and broad. So it's how paying me works, what character concepts you should be rolling into this game with, homebrew rules that I have, what kind of, what tone is the game?
Yep.
Is it a grimdark fantasy, very Witcher-like, or is it a high fantasy sword and sorcery action adventure Willow-esque adventure? Session 0 is I do it with every player. It's critical.
Yeah, and that's a good time to get a conversation going with like how the table wants to handle like inventory management, how you want to handle currency. Do you really need to be keeping track of currency when you go into the bar? Well, if you want to have that kind of game, that's a good place to have that conversation.
Yep.
Or if people just want to be like, no, we don't want to sit here and play accountant simulator. That's being able to have those conversations up front.
Yep.
During a session 0 is incredibly advantageous.
Yeah.
I tell my players that I'm really not interested in food and water that your characters are consuming unless it makes a narrative sense. I'm assuming they're all eating, drinking, and doing their business without me having to narratively describe what they're doing in number 2 in the bathroom. But if you're crossing a desert, okay, yeah, food and water might become a problem, or encumbrance is another one. I generally don't worry about it unless it's kind of absurd. Like if you're that 10 strength wizard trying to lift a boulder and carry 400 pounds worth of treasure out of a dungeon, okay, you might have to explain how you're going to swing that one by me. But for the most part, I find a lot of the crunch to be very unnecessary.
Yeah, same. There are some times where when they're going into taverns and stuff, I'll just throw a menu at them and I'll have like pre-written, and it's really simple stuff, right? I'm not doing like counting your coppers and your silvers, right? You want a meal and a night here, great. It's a gold, maybe like half a gold depending on where you are, and that's it. And we just go from there. And I think that it's really important to establish that with your players. The other thing that I want to bring up, because you did mention session 0, which is super important, and I'm always on record as saying communication is the biggest key in these games, is safety tools. Are there any particular safety tools that you like using or will always go to for your session 0s?
I have a consent list. It's as thorough as I could ever possibly imagine it as a trans woman. Red flag, yellow flag, green flag of stuff you're okay and not okay with.
Yeah.
And,
I do the same. Things are sometimes challenging with that. I'm still learning to get better at kind of, being aware of that sort of stuff. But yeah, I kind of try to stick to the same.
I also preface my game with, I try to keep somewhere between PG-13 and R, because I do play some bad guys and bad guys do bad things.
Yes.
So let me know ahead of time if there is anything that you are absolutely not comfortable with. And fortunately, my riot act and my list goes through, what do I need to avoid? But this is if a DM or if a player is not comfortable with whatever reason, saying, hey, I don't like animal abuse in my games. Not a problem. Mine don't either. But just as an example, yeah, I definitely think safety tools are, especially in this day and age, because you never know what's going to set somebody off.
Yeah. Yeah, I try and always have dialogues about it. I also use a modified version of Monty Cook's like safety checklist, which is an amazing tool for anyone who hasn't checked it out. Definitely check it out. It's great. And it's so easy to take it and add to it whatever either you just want to have, if you want to have a comprehensive one, or if you know the module that you've written or are running, you know what to put in there to be like, okay, well, here are the things that may happen. What how do you feel about these? Which I think is super important.
Now, the question I guess I have for other DMs here is, how do you manage playing a character that is evil, but not wanting to step on anybody's triggers? Because sometimes evil does those things. And my response is, it doesn't necessarily mean they do. Or if they do, it's off screen. Or you never graphically describe how things are happening. Fortunately, all my villains are not quite mustache twirling evil, but at least in my campaign, it's very classical D&D. It's a game filled with dungeons and it's a game filled with dragons. It's what you should expect out of it.
Yeah, I think for me, evil tends to be the outcome of just sort of unfortunate situations. So I don't. This is Drake and I have a Tolus game we run, and technically in the Tolus setting, it says evil is a real thing, and I don't know if I've made up my mind if that's the case yet. But I try to. My villains tend to be people whose interests create unfortunate circumstances for the players, and I try to really distance myself from purely evil, as you said, mustache twirling.
Sure, and
bad guys.
I grew up in the old era of D&D, so when everybody plays my games, you get that feeling of a chromatic dragon is evil and they're out to steal your gold and burn your town down. I love the tropes.
Yeah,
I love those tropes.
Yeah.
And I have brought that into 5th edition, who in their own Wizard of the Coast's own words, they're trying to stray away from all demons are evil and all
Yeah.
angels are good. They're trying to get rid of the alignment.
Mhm.
I like that stuff. And I think you can really not lean into it, but you can play it in such a way that it's tasteful. It requires
Oh, sure.
work, which is why I get paid the big bucks.
Yeah, that's fair. I have a lot of thoughts on the alignment system. That I've mentioned before. I do plan to eventually make a video about it and maybe even do another roundtable because there are so many views of the alignment system and even at its core, like what each alignment means, which is fascinating. But personally, I've always felt like it was necessary at one point in time, but we as a society, as a just people have evolved so much from these basic blocks of being this or that, and so I feel like there's a lot of nuances that it doesn't cover very well. Sometimes I find myself leaning towards the magic color wheel. So I played magic for a long time when I was younger, and so I'm very familiar with it, and to me it represents a lot more openness and ability to create these nuanced things where if I'm like, okay, well, I could be a lawful good paladin and there's a very clear expectation of what that means. But if I'm like a red white paladin, that could be the same thing, but there's a lot of other things that could also mean, and so it allows for a lot more wiggle room inherently.
What do you mean? 20,000 years of human evolution can't be described as their morality in a 3x3 box?
No, not
What?
anymore. There was for a long time. Yeah.
No,
And
it's the old editions. When they played into that, it was with the idea that it would have a mechanical impact in the game.
yeah.
I don't know if a lot of your viewers are familiar with how AD&D kind of worked, but there were weapons that were more impactful on the mechanical side of the game if you were a certain alignment, or you were restricted from using certain weapons if you weren't that alignment. I thought that was neat. I liked that idea. So I leaned into that a little bit and brought it into 5th edition, and I have a grading scale of character choices that they make throughout my modules that they play into it.
Yeah, and I'm also a big fan of those. I've played pretty much every edition. I started on AD&D. Like I said earlier, I despise Thaco so much, but I'm also a big fan of those kinds of like items and artifacts and the interactions. I tend to create kind of like a dynamic scale based on choices that may not necessarily fall into those particular boxes, but can still be measured on different like axes. And I tend to play my villains kind of the same way, where
Yeah.
I do like broad strokes, right? I sometimes will play the very mustache twirling bad guy, and sometimes it'll be a lot more nuanced shades of gray. Is he really the villain? Is it just that his circumstances have aligned in such a way that he is our villain but not the villain, and everything
Sure.
in between? And so I think there's a space for everything, and I think that it's important to just kind of be able to know what that space is based on your players and what the story
Yeah.
you're all collectively trying to tell.
And even then, nothing in my game is glued to a certain alignment. If a angel can fall, can a devil rise? Is one of the themes, and the ultimate villain of my main story used to be one of the best champions of the world, and through tragedy of her own circumstances and the things that happened, she went down a dark path. She's not mustachely twirling evil. She thinks she's doing a good thing, but nobody else agrees with her.
Right. Yeah.
Same.
Yeah. The villain archetypes is also something I'm always very fascinated with, right? Because there's even within the like broad spectrum of what you can do as a villain, there's these just like concepts that you can use as your sort of framework to build from there, and stuff like the fallen hero or the martyr are always such interesting things to delve into, and that's always cool to watch the party interact with them and see how they resolve that for themselves. That's actually one of my favorite villain like tropes. So the next thing that I want to ask is, we've all run games, we've all written games. What is the most important thing, do you think, when it comes to putting these games together, writing your games?
Session 0. I mean, writing the game for me as a module or writing the game for a player. That's
writing the game for you.
For me?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes, it's a tough one.
I love a good high fantasy, high magic setting. So all of the stories that I write are epic in nature, world altering. I mean, you're starting off killing to rip off of a JRPG. It starts off you're killing rats. By the end, you're fighting God, or becoming one. It's the scale rises dramatically, and I love incorporating backstories into it, especially if they're a good tragic backstory. I know it's a trope. I lean into those because I love the good trope, and I'll explain why I love them in a minute. But the best villains are the ones who are traveling with you the entire time. The best stories are the ones that the players write, and I'm just along for the ride, making sure the tracks on the road fit together.
Yeah, I like spending time with this setting and just kind of imagining interesting things that are happening there. That's a lot of the genesis of what Polarity is right now, is just sort of spending time in the region of the Beyond, in the Ninth World, in the Numenera setting, and just kind of looking at what's here, what cities are here, who are some of the NPCs, what are some things that have recently happened according to the lore that would allow for some interesting scenarios for a group of characters who are sort of, prime for adventure. What is the opportunity that'll pull a group of people who we might describe as adventurers in a narrative context? What's an interesting scenario that'll rope them in? I tend to avoid a lot of, for myself, I tend to avoid a lot of high fantasy concepts. Arguably, Polarity, the stakes are a bit higher in Polarity than they usually are in the stuff I tend to write. But I think it's because I come from more of the science fiction side of things and less of the high fantasy side of things. I'm more interested in internal spaces of characters' minds than I am about like epic heroes and villains. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I'm gonna be that guy again. I'm that middle ground, right? Where I was brought up on the high fantasy, right? So I'm very invested a lot of the time in doing these campaigns that will eventually become grand epic adventures. Exploration is always very important for me. It's important that as they traverse the land, they feel like they're doing so, and there's always something amazing to experience. At the same time, a lot of the value that I find in these games is in the social aspect, seeing how relationships form between the characters and how they grow, how they'll react to each other as they learn more and see things that might not necessarily be acceptable or even understandable to them, but because they understand the character beside them who's doing it, how that will impact their decisions, and the amazing ways that these characters, who are in essence their own real living breathing creations, just grow organically and adapt over time.
Yeah.
That sort of organic storytelling is phenomenal and so interesting.
When Claire mentioned science fiction, I just remembered one of my favorite writers who influenced me a lot for the stories I write is a guy named Gene Roddenberry, who Star Trek.
Yep.
And one of his themes when he wrote, especially for the original series and the Next Generation, was a lot of episodes explored something in our political or social or cultural identity as Americans or as Europeans or as a world culture of a problem that had, whether it be racism between African Americans or white Americans, or if it was between Americans and Russians, as the Klingons in Federation were representatives of. As a DM, I have taken that inspiration, and I also like to explore problems in our own political way, which a lot of people say, "Well, get your woke politics out of my D&D." That's not what I'm doing. You are exploring problems in a metaphor, combating transphobia, homophobia, You're combating racism or discovering its ugly light in a way that your characters can impact it. I'm not trying to teach you wokeism. I'm explaining through a story in a narrative sense that these problems that you're facing in this game are real in real life, and you can find ways to defeat them that don't involve you usually stabbing somebody in the face.
Yeah.
I love exploring those topics.
It's actually very funny that you bring that up, just because that's going to be one of the big topics in my upcoming actual play series that I'm doing. Is going to be dealing with I don't want to spoil anything, but it's going to be dealing with a lot of those issues and the way that we see and interact with each other on a cultural level, and how that can change both on like a micro and a macro level.
If you ever follow my Twitter, I get into it a lot with people, especially in the TTRP community, who are the old school, the grognards from way back in the day. They want their D&D to be people from Karatur are Asian people from Chulter, whatever the heck that Chult is supposed to be. The people who got really upset when the Vistani from Strahd were incredibly stereotyped as poor Eastern Europeans. And when people got really upset when those things were changed, when Wizards of the Coast finally went, this was emblematic of how things were back then. This does not represent our cultural identity nowadays. We're going to fix that. I was totally for it because it was insensitive and it was poorly written. It was tropey in a product of the era.
Yes, I think that's the most important thing to point out. Is it was a product of the era, and like we talked about a little earlier, as we've evolved as a people, we've gotten to the point where this is no longer something that not just we don't need anymore, but also that we don't have to tolerate. And you see a lot of the people like who you've mentioned, these people who are arguing about how can you make orcs not inherently evil? And it's like, well, it's very simple. You just acknowledge that no group of people or race is ever going to be entirely evil or entirely good. And you can absolutely still have cultural ideals and have things that play a role in how they are likely to end up because of that, but that doesn't really need to translate to it has to be this way.
And I think what the biggest problem that both sides of the spectrum have missed is that it is up to the DM and the players to decide how that is meant to be. If a group of players wants to say, I want my orcs evil, my devils evil, and I want my angels good, cool. That's your style of game. There is nothing wrong with that. If I want to say I want my angels to be morally ambiguous, because even if they're doing good things doesn't mean they're good for everybody, and I want my devils to be morally ambiguous because just as they're doing evil stuff doesn't mean it's evil for everybody, you can absolutely do that. Those are both acceptable ways to play the game. There is no wrong way to play pretend.
Absolutely. So, the next thing I'd like to ask is, if you were going to give like one or two tips to any DMs or GMs out there looking to get into your respective fields, like either getting into paid play or trying to make YouTube video games, what would you have to say to them, Claire?
I think, I mean, it's tricky. The Infinite Construct sort of does two things right now, because we've got some actual play stuff that's on the channel, but for most of its existence, it's been a kind of tips and tricks thing. So I think a really important step is to figure out which one of those you want to do and invest the time to build your brand and perspective with what you want to do with that, and to try to find a unique thing to do with that. I mean, like for me, I picked Numenera because it's a game that I've always liked, but also there wasn't really anything like that out there. And so I think if you're looking to do content online, finding unique avenues that you can express that are unique to you and unique to the way that you understand that, and sharing your vision and contributing that, I think it's a really great way, because then you're going to be inspired to make the content, because you're making stuff that you want to make because it's unique and special to you. So finding that and just starting small, I think is the best way forward, and just focusing on accomplishing concrete small projects and getting stuff done. I think is a really great way to start with building a channel or something like that.
Awesome. Bethany?
There's so many things. I wouldn't even know where to begin, but forgive me if this turns into a ramble.
Go
Um,
for it.
as a paid DM, I have learned a lot of very hard lessons. That's not just about being a DM, but also being a business owner. So this is going to kind of blend the two. Um, from the professional side, never take anything personally from another player. You are trying to sell something. Not everybody is going to like your product. It's just the nature of life. Lean into your strengths. If you're a great storyteller, tell a great story. If you know how to play a game mechanically, build those encounters perfectly. But don't become so arrogant that you think you have no flaws. There's always somebody who is better at something than you are. So I often join other games as a player just to see, what does this DM do that I like? What do they do that I don't like? How can I incorporate that into my game? Always be trying to improve yourself, because anything can be made better. Don't do business with friends ever. That is the hardest lesson I had to learn. Don't do business with friends. Um, keep an eye on your accounts, your balances, because cool thing is I got a lot of my stuff back in taxes. Networking. Know people. Right now, especially in Roll20, the market is flooded with pro DMs, or at least people that charge for games. I can't really call a lot of them professional because I've joined some of them and they've been very eh. If you want to be a pro DM, don't skimp on your quality. You have to provide something that almost nobody else can provide if you're charging money for it. So if you using Roll20 as the example, because that's where I do a lot of my business from, have your dynamic lighting, use your maps, use your music, use your voices, use your talents, use your modules appropriately. If you're just going to do a white screen with theater of the mind, people can get that anywhere. Stand out. Be better.
I think those are absolutely great tips. I think that's some great insight. Uh, is there anything that you guys would like to bring up or ask or go over at all?
Pro DMing is probably one of the hardest jobs that I've ever had to do. And this is coming from somebody who's done the military. As a control freak, as a perfectionist, as somebody who is trans, you're trying to balance a lot of things in your personal life that are going to take away the quality of a game. And you have to learn to balance what you're offering versus what people want. So don't, as I said before, don't take it personal if somebody doesn't like what you do, and keep trying. Just be better. You know, take inspiration from the stories that you love, the shows that you've watched, the DMs you've played with. It's not stealing; it's inspiration, unless you copy their stuff. Which, I'm no plagiarism. No, I don't do piracy or plagiarism. But if you looked at my campaign setting, you're going to go, a lot of this looks like it's from something else I've seen before. The answer is it probably is, because I love Star Trek. I love Star Wars. I love Willow. I love Warhammer. I love a lot of different anime. I love Final Fantasy. I'm a gamer. So you're going to see the mishmash and hodgepodge of stuff that I have grown up with over the last 30 years that are in my games. And if that's what you love and you can craft it well, maybe somebody else will fall in love with it too.
Heck yeah. I was just talking to some people about that today, where sometimes people get these ideas and they're like, well, it's too close or it's too reminiscent of this other actual piece of media. And it's like, well, that's not a bad thing. Just find ways to make it your own.
Everything is too.
Exactly. Yeah. There's no such thing as an original idea, right? Is one of the more popular sayings I hear a lot. It's like, right.
Yeah.
And then you just grow. That's how the everything grows and evolves, is because each of us in our own way put something into it, and what it comes out as is something completely different, and then the next person will do the same, and it's beautiful how that happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting, like seeing there's been a lot of resistance to the recent Halo TV show, because a lot of the changes they've made, a lot of people are upset that has taken away from what has made Halo unique. And It's like, sure, Halo did a lot of things that was unique. It was also largely a giant derivative work, taking from Starship Troopers and Alien and Ringworld, and like that, like those were concepts that were already in place. So
Sure.
things that are unique,
Uh,
there's
you know,
very few ideas that are unique.
Warhammer is basically a copy of Dune.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mentioned earlier that I like leaning into tropes. And because we mentioned earlier, there's nothing original anymore. And things are tropes because people recognize them and people want to attach to things they recognize. You don't have to play a ranger that is socially brusque and dark of mood. But if you do, it's all about the flavor you can add to it. And that goes for a character or a campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I like to always tell people when they come to me about characters or campaigns or even just spaces, settings, is remember that it all kind of functions the same way, right? You look at the mechanics, and no matter what your mechanics are, they aren't they don't have to be intrinsically tied to the flavor, the cover that you put over it. What you can do with that can reach so far beyond the basic concepts of what you're given to start with. Don't ever feel like you're trapped in a box where you have to do these tropes or you have to do these very specific characters or settings or stories.
I find that to be very gatekeeping, which is something else I would like to talk about for a second.
Yeah, let's do it.
I plead, especially to the old school gamers, if a player comes to you and you're a DM and you like your combat difficult, your exploration to be deadly, and you want to go down to the knit and grit, and a player just got off watching an episode of Critical Role and wanted to get something like that, don't chase them away. Point them in the direction that they might like that kind of thing. Because there's only so many of us nerds out there who enjoy D&D. And back in the day, it used to be a source of our pride that, this was our box, and I don't want new people in my box because it's not making me comfortable. It's not like that anymore. We're supposed to be accepting of new people to bring them all together and enjoy a good story or enjoy a good narrative. Don't chase people away just because you want it to be the old way. If you don't want them to play your game, fine. You play how you want to play. But there's lots of seats and lots of tables out there.
And there's not anything inherently wrong with someone not being a fit for your table either.
Yeah.
You can just want to do and present something different from what they want to experience. And like you said, it's as easy as going, okay, well, this is not going to work, but here's where you can go to look into what it is. And another thing is, D&D is constantly breaking its record for sales. The amount of people who are playing it year after year has only gone up and continues to do so because it's become popular now. This is part of mainstream culture, and there are a lot of people out there who are like, "Oh, it's awful. They don't know what they're doing. It's this new like watered down thing." And it's like, "No, this is beautiful. This is amazing because on top of having a bigger community, there's so many more voices in it now and so many more sets of eyes to experience and to take in and output and create more of what makes this hobby, this thing special."
My favorite players are the new ones because they have come into this game with no expectations. They have come into this game having no idea about anything. They came into it with a character concept. They watched a show, or it's all totally original, that they went, I want to play something that's kind of like this, and you can build their mechanics around that. That is the best part of this game. I love new players because I could show them the best aspects of D&D without having to grind them against some of its darker tropes.
Okay, and with that, I think we're gonna come to a pretty natural conclusion here. I think that's a really good place to end this. I know there's some stuff that each of you wanted to talk about before we ended. So, Claire, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so the Infinite Construct has finished filming the first half of Polarity Eisegesis. So that should be out before the spring is over. I am hoping to have all of Polarity Eisegesis done before the spring is over. I think that's a doable thing. I'm not committing to dates right now, only because I did that with Exegesis, and that was a pretty rough editing slog to meet that deadline. So definitely giving myself a bit more time with that. But you can look forward to the conclusion potentially of what was kind of laid forth with polarity exegesis following a new party and a different system and a different side of what was going on. So that's YouTube, the Infinite Construct.
Awesome. Bethany?
Yeah, sure. If you are interested in learning how to be a DM or want to be a pro DM, I have absolutely no problem showing you how that's done. If you want to be a player in one of my games, you can find me on Twitter at DMOpal. I'm also really looking forward to enjoying more streamed games, and the current one that I'm active in is on the screen behind me. Is the character I'm playing. It's at the Component Cast on Twitch and Twitter. It's another D&D high fantasy adventure that I would really enjoy interacting with new cast members and new chats and new people, more people.
Always good to grow the community. And I'll throw in a shameless plug here. Uh, Dice Trays Action is going to have its premiere episode April 26th over on Twitch at 8:30 p.m. Eastern, and will be available on YouTube 2 days later. So come check that out as well. Thank you both for joining me for this. This was awesome.
Thank
I had a
you.
lot of fun.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks.
hope I can have y'all on again and we can talk more
Anytime.
stuff because there's always more to discuss. So until then, thanks for watching, and we'll be back soon.